Hey guys, I just want to let you know before we start this video that in a few days I'll be changing my YouTube channel name from Aqua to That Boy Aqua, just to make it easier to find and whatnot. So if you notice that the channel name has changed, that is why. Please enjoy the video, and big shout outs to our gold tier patrons, A-Beat, Ghostly Gaming, and Pirate. Thanks so much guys, enjoy the video. My experience with Assassin's Creed Odyssey was an inconsistent one. When writing my notes during my two playthroughs, I found myself saying that I loved aspects of the game at one point, while writing the polar opposite hours later. I will admit that just because the game was inconsistent at points doesn't mean it's a bad game, and a lot of you had mentioned in the comments of my other Assassin's Creed videos that the worst in the series is Odyssey, and while I shouldn't have done this, I let the comments influence me, and I went into Odyssey expecting to hate it. I was pleasantly surprised, and as you've seen from the title of this video, I think it's a lot better than people give it credit for. I want to clarify that everything said in this video is my opinion, and I'm not saying that with hopes that subjectivity will shield me from criticism, but with hopes that my words don't come across as facts. If you don't like this game, that's perfectly fine, and I have nothing against you or your opinion. I'm totally open to having a discussion with you guys in the comments, and with that being said, let me try and give you a different perspective on this game. And if you hated it or didn't think it looked good, then maybe I can change your mind. As you likely know, Odyssey has followed in its predecessor's footsteps of radically diverging from the standard Assassin's Creed formula. Everything, and I mean everything, has been overhauled. Not necessarily improved, but definitely altered heavily. One thing that is consistent across all Assassin's Creed games, however, is the world. I think whether you're a fan of the series or not, you can't deny that every time Ubisoft releases an Assassin's Creed game, or frankly any of their AAA titles, the world is always top-notch, and Odyssey is no different. Ancient Greece is beautiful, from the massive oceans to the volcanic islands to the cities of Athens and Sparta. There's a great sense of verticality to the world despite the lack of buildings that we've seen in previous games and the borderline skyscrapers that we saw in Syndicate. Something that all Assassin's Creed games have in common is the historical accuracy of their worlds. Odyssey is again no different, as based on what I myself have studied on ancient Greece, which isn't a lot mind you, and along with what I've seen online, I can confidently say that the world is fairly accurate, and the historical accuracy extends to a special game mode for those who just want to see the world, but that'll have to wait until later. The point is, I seriously got lost in staring at the world and looking at the architecture of the buildings. Don't get me wrong, some liberties were taken in the world's design to fit it in with this mystical adventure style theme, but regardless, it's clear that there was a lot of love and care put into the world and its design. A quick side note, something I don't really mention in these Assassin's Creed videos is the historical aspect of the game, but it's one of my favorite parts of the series. Almost every game sees you in a different time period with brand new setting, and since I'm a history major, studying the French Revolution for example, and then walking around in a virtual recreation of it is such an awesome feeling, even if it's not perfect. The citizens around the world blend right in with the time period, and the weapons and gear all look great even if they can be a little ridiculous at times. The tents around the world look slightly off, and this applies to a lot of the decorations such as the weapon racks. They don't look perfectly straight, and this gives the world that extra sense of realism it needs. As far as the graphics themselves, I won't spend too much time on, as you can clearly see from looking at the video that the game looks great. Even at 720p, this game looks awesome, and specifically the water in this game is just beautiful. Now, another thing that Ubisoft is known to do is really push the envelope with their games. We saw it with Unity, and we see it now with Odyssey. The issue that arises with this pushing of the envelope is that the game sometimes can't really keep up with its own ambitions. Now, remember when I mentioned that Odyssey is wildly inconsistent? This is one of those ways. The world itself looks good, and the textures on objects look top-notch most of the time. I couldn't even count the amount of times I'd be running along the rooftops getting my stealth on, only to stop and wonder if the texture I'm looking at is really that compressed. Seconds and sometimes up to a minute later, the texture would pop in, and this honestly made me giggle a few times, and the brutally long time it took for the textures to load almost became a game in itself. Whenever I saw a poor looking texture, I would begin to stare at it until it fully loaded in. Now, just because I personally had fun seeing how long it would take for the textures to load and then mocking it with my friends, doesn't mean that it's not an issue. These poor looking textures stand out like a sore thumb and can easily pull you out of your immersion. Getting immersed in a world is one of the biggest appeals of this game and many other Western RPGs, so having this issue can be borderline detrimental. I understand that I can't fault the game too much, as on the bright side, the frame rate is one of the most stable in the franchise, at least for me running on a PlayStation 4. I'd assume that the game's multiple minute long loading time upon startup would help alleviate this issue, but sadly it doesn't. And while we're on the topic of loading screens, there are a lot of them and they are long. Granted, once the world loads, you could see only one loading screen in 4 hours if you're doing open world activities, aside from the odd stutter here and there. You'll likely notice this stutter, or more accurately this pause, while sailing, as it's easily the fastest way to move through the world, and I think it happens because the game needs that extra second to load the environments in. It didn't happen too often and it never lasted longer than a second, but I figure I should mention it. Back to loading screens, you'll see them most frequently during main story missions, and with one section in particular being downright hilarious. Now, there's a point where during the middle of a boss battle, and if you don't want spoilers, skip to this time in the video. Okay, Ready? In a boss battle against your sibling, a tree falls on them and you're given a very quick choice to either help them or save them. And despite the choice, you get a loading screen for a few seconds, and then there's what I swear is less than a full second of cutscene where a tree falls on you and then another loading screen pops up. The scene of the tree falling on you was so fast and quick that I genuinely had no idea what happened, and I had to rewind my footage to watch it again. There was 5 seconds of loading for barely a single second of cutscene. This wasn't the only example of the loading times being strangely long, but for all of you who have skipped ahead, welcome back, and just for you guys, I have footage on screen showing one of the many loading screens. Now, I have done a lot of criticizing when it comes to the loading screens and the loading times, but it's because with such a long loading screen, I would expect the game to have all the textures and environments ready to go. In the case of some cutscenes, there was a lot of times where there was this fade to black in the scene so that the rest could load with the one I mentioned earlier. I would much rather have a long loading screen for a long cutscene rather than a loading screen, short cutscene, loading screen, part 2 of cutscene, and so on. I understand if they have to change the environments, they might need to have a loading screen in between cuts, but in a lot of cases, the environment isn't really changing a lot, if at all. Despite the issues with the loading screens, I can at least say that whoever designed the loading screens definitely deserves a raise, because I don't know if you guys can notice this, but the loading screens in this game are finally no longer a blinding white. The fact that this game's loading screens don't melt your face off alone makes it a huge improvement on every game that has come before. Thank God they finally changed it. The animations in the game look fine enough, with basic run animations looking good, but while it might be a small detail, with the map being so huge, you're gonna find yourself riding on horseback a lot. Thankfully, the horse riding animation looks spectacular, and while I don't usually talk about sound design in games due to my terrible hearing, I think we can all agree that the gallops of the horse could possibly be the most satisfying sound ever. Switching to our main character, I really want to praise the fact that you can actually switch your gender in this game. One of the first decisions in the game is whether you want to play as the male protagonist Alexios or the female protagonist Cassandra. This choice doesn't really affect the story or the gameplay in any way, but it's a great decision on Ubisoft's end, and I seriously hope this choice carries into the next games, as I personally loved playing as Cassandra. I should mention that it seems like Ubisoft considers Alexios to be canon, as he is on most of the promotional art and the cover of the game, but in the book that was tied to this game, Cassandra is the main character, so I don't really know. I'm gonna go with the book and consider Cassandra to be the main canon character. No matter what gender you pick, the animations are the same, and boy do these look good. The way you throw your entire weight into an attack when using the hammer compared to the multiple swift strikes with the daggers looks just as good as when you're poking and prodding at your enemies with a spear. The weapons all feel like they really do some damage, and the finishing moves that are automatically performed when killing the last enemy in a group looks as stylish and as slick as ever. Using your fists is just as fun too, as the enemies get knocked out from a flying Superman punch to the temple. The parry animation is really satisfying, and it's important that it's so satisfying since you'll have used it over 1,000 times by the end of the game. The overpower attacks that you're eventually capable of doing with all the weapon types look really brutal, even if they do eventually get old after a while. I found that the animations when it came to combat were relatively bug-free, especially when compared to earlier games in the franchise, but that's not to say there weren't a few hilarious glitches.
Nothing special about this spear.
The designs of the weapons were also great, with legendary gear looking especially badass. Of course, there wasn't a massive variety of designs, but there was enough variety for new weapons and gear to be always interesting. The armor you can get looks just as good, and this variety of gear allows you to shape your character into whatever you want to be that a Spartan war veteran or an Athenian ghost. I do wish there was an easier way to customize the color of this gear, but I feel like I might be dipping my toes into nitpick territory with that, so I'll keep it at that. One feature they did include was a system that we've seen before in other RPGs where you can make the appearance of your gear separate from the stats of the gear. For example, I might get a piece of gear that has great stats, but it's the ugliest armor since the armor of Brutus. You can change the appearance of the armor to be that of another piece of gear. This was great because I could wear a bunch of different gear while still keeping my same appearance. It's important to enjoy the way your character looks while pulling a spear through someone's chest, but the way you pull a spear through someone's chest quietly is just as important. The stealth animations are expertly crafted, however, I can't help but feel like they definitely are not as quiet as the game seems to think they are. I mean, you can do a stealth combo where you sweep someone off their feet and once they smash into the ground, you stab them as they make a groan, and yet the guard 5 feet away is completely oblivious. Jumping from the top of a building on top of an enemy is still so satisfying, and getting on top of that building looks good too. The traversal animations seem to be quite similar to those featured in Origins, and while some animations have been brought over from Unity and Syndicate, they still look good, and while I'm not entirely blown away by the animations, I think think they work well given the architecture of the world. I find myself still considering Unity to have the best animations when it comes to traversal, and I know that's an opinion a lot of you disagree with, but I just feel like Unity nailed that sense of finesse and fluidity. This sense of style was somewhat lost with the traversal of Odyssey, as you mostly jump up walls rather than climb them. I understand that this has to be the case because the buildings and structures in ancient Greece were oftentimes very smooth and were obviously not built for climbing. The animations where Alexios is being shot at while running away also look like it's out of some action movie. Regardless, the animations were fine and looked smooth and well put together. Finally, when it comes to the animations, the cutscenes are where they shine the most. Throughout the game, you'll be talking to people in this fixed camera angle that always reminded me of the Arkham games, and the reason I bring up this comparison is because while it's a similar setup, the characters in Odyssey have more motion and enthusiasm with their words, and they speak with their bodies rather than just being a talking head. When Alexios is feeling defensive, he crosses his arms and has a visible scowl on his face, which really adds to those scenes, even if the lip syncing isn't the best at times.
You can't go where I'm going. I need to be alone.
And even if the voice acting is a little inconsistent.
Big fucking trouble, but I'll pay her back. When I'm done with you, I'm gonna find your mother and bring her your fucking head.
The cutscenes are where the game really shines though, as the motions of the characters all look great and the amount of detail in these cutscenes goes miles for fleshing out the story and its characters. The facial expressions and overall animations look really good most of the time.
Cyclops. That's how he bought his vineyard?
Look, I know you'd be dead without one.
Most of the time. Sometimes the lip syncing specifically was inconsistent, but it didn't take me out of the experience. While I don't have the experience to say much on the cinematography of the cutscenes, I can say that I enjoyed them a lot, and even on a second playthrough, I didn't skip the cutscenes. Of course, the cutscenes were not quite perfect all the time, so I don't want to gush over them too much, as on one playthrough, the cutscenes were fine, but on the second, I had ones like this. Or, for an example on both playthroughs, this one. Now, I know I just spent quite a lot of time talking about animations, and I usually do in these Assassin's Creed videos, but I feel like the animations of a game get overlooked so much in reviews for games, and in games with a huge emphasis on immersion and action, I think it's such an important part of a game's identity and charm. This is especially true for RPGs like Odyssey, as you'll be seeing these animations for upwards of 50 hours, and that's not including DLC, miscellaneous side quests, collectibles, and New Game Plus. So now that we've talked about the animations, I think it's time we talk about the gameplay, as it's where the series has seen the biggest change. I want to clarify that Origins and Odyssey are very similar games, so when I say things like Odyssey changed the combat, they didn't really, as Origins pretty much did most of it first. But they have changed a lot compared to the older Assassin's Creed games like 2, 3, 4, Unity, and so on. And since a majority of this video will have comparisons between those games and this one, I'll refer to those changes made in Origins and Odyssey together for simplicity's sake. One of the most series-defining aspects of Assassin's Creed is the free-running system, a system that has been done so well even since the first game and has seen numerous revisions and overhauls. I've already made a video discussing the improvements that the more recent games in the franchise have made to the parkour system, so I won't bother making comparisons to Assassin's Creed 2, despite the fact that a lot of people say it's the best in the franchise. In my opinion, as I'm sure a lot of you know, Assassin's Creed Unity perfected the free-running system. Your character was able to jump, dive, and climb literally anything, so how does Odyssey improve on this? Well, it doesn't. Don't get me wrong, the free running is still good, in fact I'd say it's great, but it has seen a severe simplification. While in previous games you have to hold R2 to free run, and whilst holding R2 and holding X you can free run up and circle to free run down, or just keep holding R2 and you'll just run forwards. I go into more depth on this system in my Assassin's Creed Unity video, so watch that first if you haven't already. In Odyssey, the free running is activated through just holding X. You simply climb buildings all the same, but now climbing mountains and other surfaces are a little bit easier, if a little more unrealistic. Climbing statues, for example, were made much easier, as your character can grab onto pretty much anything.
I should probably not climb on this.
It's not a big deal, but it's the first example we'll see of the franchise heading in a more unrealistic direction. Another example of the lack of realism will be the fall damage. One thing that makes the free running in Assassin's Creed fun is the danger element to it. If you make a wrong jump, you'll take some damage from falling, or you'll draw attention to yourself, or maybe you'll lose your target, or maybe you'll just die. In games like Syndicate, the parkour was more scripted, to the point where the game wouldn't even let you just jump off a building. You essentially couldn't make a wrong jump. In Odyssey, however, there's essentially no penalty in making making a wrong jump. When I first started my new game, I immediately saw a massive statue and thought, I want to climb that. And within a few minutes, that's exactly what I did. Once up there, however, I couldn't see a haystack at the bottom. I decided I would just wing it and aim for the bushes. However, I quickly realized I'd be hitting the ground feet first. But once I did, I realized I barely survived. Literally, like what looked like 1 HP left. I initially thought, wow, barely survived that one, but I eventually realized that I was always just surviving falls with 1 HP. Whenever I would make a risky jump, I would hit the ground and lose a ton of health, only for my health to regenerate to full within the next few seconds. I know that explaining my experience with the fall damage might seem unnecessary, but I wanted to show you guys my exact thought process and show you how quickly you realize that there is no consequence to falling. In fact, eventually halfway through the game, you get an upgrade that allows you to take no fall damage whatsoever. Now, I have to admit, I had buckets of fun throwing myself off a mountain, but this does really make climbing much less important and fun than previous games. I'm torn with my criticism here because it's clear that due to the design of the world, there isn't much room for Alexios to be moving in the same way that Arno or Ezio does. And especially considering the time period, I would also have to assume that free-running techniques were not as advanced or even developed at all. So part of me wants to say that I wish they had a more complex movement system, but at the same time, I feel like that criticism is easily countered by saying that there isn't a lot of room for that kind of movement, and it's clear that combat and exploration was where the focus of the game is. Part of exploring is riding around on horseback and climbing mountains. Climbing rock surfaces works the same as any other surface, but it often felt like I wasn't really grabbing onto anything, just digging my hands into the wall, similar to the way Breath of the Wild worked. Aside from diving off of mountains and scaling massive sculptures, you'll often find yourself riding around on horseback as well. While riding on horseback is definitely fun and a great way to get across the world, I have a huge issue with the way the horses react to residential areas. When approaching a city, your horse will quickly switch from its high-speed gallop to a slow prance, which is fine, but this transition happens hundreds of meters from the city's walls. It sucked because I would be forced to slow down and it felt like such a pace breaker. The speed you're limited to in a town is also far too slow. I understand that having a slower speed would allow the player more control and would allow them to avoid getting stuck in a building or a blacksmith tent, but I wish they had a sprint button on the horse so if you need to quickly pass through the town, you could. If I was trying to get somewhere and there was a city directly in front of my path, I would steer straight to the right and take a detour outside of the vicinity of the city just so I wouldn't be slowed down. I don't know if doing this is more efficient or not, but that's my only real criticism with horseback riding, but otherwise, it's one of the ways the game is a little inconsistent, as riding horseback is awesome in the open fields, but within cities, it should be avoided. Of course, when sailing over the massive ocean, you have your ship, which can travel insanely fast with the travel speed feature. I know this feature was present in Black Flag, but I still think it's worth praising. The game also has a fast travel feature that is unlocked once you synchronize a viewpoint, so if riding on your horse or sailing the violent waves isn't your thing, there is an option for you. Now, once you get to your destination, you'll probably be falling into some sort of stealth or combat scenario. When it comes to stealth, things feel pretty familiar. You can sneak around in bushes, scout from the rooftops, and of course, do the old stabby. However, the hidden blade is gone. Now you use your broken spear, which has some plot significance behind it, but I won't get into the plot just yet. The spear works the same as the hidden blade, but the amount of damage you do is based on your level and the gear you're rocking, so why don't we put stealth and combat on hold for a second and talk about how the gear system works. Your character has 5 different stats, all of which is based on your level and can be further increased through gear and engravings. The 5 stats are health, hunter damage, which involves damage with bows, warrior damage, which is all about combat, assassin damage, which is related to stealth takedowns, and armor, which is based on the stats of your armor. These stats can be increased through the engravings on your gear. For example, you might get a hood that gives you an extra 17% hunter damage and an extra 24% damage on Spartan soldiers. Certain gear sets will give you a bonus that stacks on top of these individual gear bonuses, such as having all arrows do more hunter damage and pierce shields. This gear system is integral to having the most amount of fun in the game, but unfortunately it's not explained very well, if at all. There isn't a tutorial for how gear works in the game except for a brief message on the heads up display. It made new gear more interesting since I'd pick up a piece of gear such as a helmet that theoretically was worse than the helmet I had equipped, but it had better engravings than the one I had. Certain engravings can be found in the world too that can be brought to the blacksmith to be forged onto your gear and weapons. These stat boosts are not the only thing that can be used to upgrade your character, as your abilities can too. After acquiring a certain amount of experience, which can be gained from doing everything from assassinations, combat, looting, discovering new areas, and pretty much everything else in the game, you level up. Upon leveling up, you receive an ability point to spend in one of the 3 skill trees. These trees are Hunter, Warrior, and Assassin. Spending your skill points in certain trees will allow you to unlock abilities that make things like assassinating targets more efficient and easier. There are 2 types of skills, stat boosting skills and abilities. A stat boosting skill is self-explanatory, such as having your attacks do more damage or having more effective armor. The abilities are easily the coolest part of the gameplay, as they give your character that extra edge they need in combat, and it often looks really cool. To give an example, someone speccing into the hunter tree would likely invest in the predator shot, where they can control where the arrow goes mid-air, or the spread shot ability, where they can fire at multiple enemies at once. Eventually, you get an ability that not only increases the amount of damage you do with bows, but also slows down time when aiming with a bow in mid-air. You can also send down a hailstorm of arrows that can ambush large groups of enemies. There's plenty more upgrades, but it would be redundant to go through all of them. Say you prefer a more hands-on approach, then the assassin tree will work best for you, as skills allow you to not only do more damage, but you can give yourself an ability where you can throw your spear from a distance and quickly run in to finish your target. And this ability is awesome, because you can chain this attack together up to 3 times, so if there's a group of enemies that just won't split up, you can still handle it. You can also unlock critical assassinations, where if you, instead of pressing triangle to assassinate your target, you can hold triangle to perform a critical assassination which deals 2 times the damage. If you do end up in conflict, then you can use your poison ability, which adds a poison buff to your weapon, and the hero strike ability can be used to quickly take down an enemy and do massive assassin damage. Maybe you're the type who thinks to hell with the quiet approach, then the warrior tree is right up your alley. Basic skill upgrades include taking more damage and doing more damage, as well as the ability to add a fire buff to your weapons. Here you'll also find your rush abilities, overpower combos, your healing abilities, and of course, a beautiful Spartan kick. Every ability I've just mentioned costs some adrenaline to use. Some abilities vary from things like the Sparta kick using only 1 bar of adrenaline, while an overpower strike will use 3. Adrenaline is gained from doing damage, dodging, and parrying, as well as assassinating with certain abilities like the critical assassinations. These skill trees, while having awesome abilities, are locked behind the level of your spear. You can upgrade your spear by assassinating certain enemies, and the way they do this is great. There are about 40 of these special enemies around the map, and they are all part of this group called the Cult of Kosmos. They're basically Templars, and they have the same ideals and goals, but they don't share the name of Templar, and after that, that's about it. After about 10 hours or so, you'll have a section on your menu that shows the cult and the members you know of. In order to find members of the cult, you have to collect clues, which can be found by doing side quests and looting chests. Fortunately, the act of finding clues happens quite naturally, and while there are some that require you to really comb an area for leads, it never felt like they were annoying to find. Each of these cultists holds a special artifact, and once you collect enough of them, you can upgrade the spear. These cultists, however, range from level 10 to 50, so you can't take them all down in one session. With some upgrades being locked behind your spear level, it means that the abilities you want aren't just locked behind some sort of level requirement. You have to go out and get them, and in a way, the amount of artifacts you get your hands on is dictated by your level, but you can still take out a cultist 5 levels above you if you're crafty. This progression system works well, in my opinion, however, it does stumble a bit, specifically around the level 15 to 20 area and the level 40 to 50 area. When you're starting the game, you'll usually be 1 or 2 levels below the next story mission requirement. If you do a few side quests, you'll be ready to go quite fast. However, the story missions will take huge jumps, with one mission recommending you be level 24 and the next recommending you be at least level 32. On one hand, I appreciate that doing this encourages you to explore and do side quests, but it can feel like a bit of a grind. I'd be in a position where I've been doing the story for upwards of 4 hours and now I just have to stop. And the grind to get the recommended level at some points was so long that I would forget parts of the story and begin to say, oh yeah, that happened, or oh yeah, this person died. I want to clarify that the activities around the world were fun and the side quests in this game were some of the best in the series, but when I got locked off from the rest of the story, I found myself saying, well shit, I wanted to see what happens next. This is one of the many ways the game is inconsistent, as at some points the progression feels awesome, but at other points it feels like a bit of a grind. Another instance is the level 40 to 50 area. By the time you finish the main storyline, you'll likely be around level 40, but there is a separate main questline that can get you the true ending. In order to finish this questline, you need to be at least level 48, but level 50 is what they recommend. The thing is, exploring and doing side quests are fine because side quests scale to your level, which is awesome, but it's another situation of just wanting to get to the good stuff sooner than later. Some have criticized the fact that there are microtransactions in the game, and use this level gap as an example of Ubisoft pushing you to use EXP boosters, but I never really felt that push. I felt a push to go exploring and a push to do some side missions, and sure, it's not good that Ubisoft put microtransactions in the game, but it's not being shoved down your throat. Some have said that the game can always feel slightly unfair, which forces you to cave in and buy a booster, but I didn't find the game too difficult, and as a lot of you know, I'm terrible at games. I was fine by regularly making sure my gear was where it needed to be and making sure I had the right engravings, and I never really had an issue with the difficulty. If the game is so difficult that you feel like you need to buy a booster pack, then you can always lower the difficulty too. Lowering the difficulty to easy, for example, makes the game a complete breeze. On top of that, you can adjust the level scaling so that enemies will always be a lower level than you. The game naturally scales the world to your level, and some have used this as a point to say that the leveling is is pointless because you're always going to be a lower level than your enemies. But that isn't really true, as I often went to weaker areas just to one-shot people, and the upside to the world scaling to your level is the fact that the experience always scales too, meaning that if you were to see a quest and leave it for later, you can still get ample rewards such as experience and money for completing the quest later on. This gap that forces you to do side quests can work in the game's favor, and in order to illustrate this, I want to talk about a series of quest lines. Upon arriving and docking on a new island, you'll see a kid who will take you on a Minotaur tour around the city. It's a basic quest where the kid just tries to nickel and dime you for as much money as he can while also telling you stories about an ancient Minotaur. But it's overall a cute quest and it doesn't really go anywhere. Upon finishing this quest, however, you'll then see a man boasting about an actual Minotaur, or so it seems. After doing some trials that also involved an attempt to get your money from you, he finally takes you to the Minotaur.
I am the Minotaur.
What?
Unfortunately, this quote-unquote Minotaur is just some dude wearing a bull mask, and once you see this, a bunch of bandits ambush you. This sucked for multiple reasons. One, it was anticlimactic as hell. Two, they really made it seem like there was an actual Minotaur hanging around because there are huge statues of Minotaurs leading you to believe that there will actually be a mythical beast for you to slay. After doing a few more side missions though, I came across a lonely child who told me that his father and a group of adventurers went into some ruins and never returned. After helping him out, I went through this strange looking maze, and at the end, my god, they actually have a secret boss against a Minotaur, and he absolutely wiped the floor with me. I was a little discouraged, but I decided I would leave it for now and come back when I leveled up a little bit more, and when I did, I literally tore the horn off of him. This is one of the most memorable moments in the entire game, and there were quite a few of these moments in the game. So I know with these 2 points I've just contradicted myself, but the best way to explain this is the progression is inconsistent. Sometimes it's good, and sometimes it's not so much. Now this progression and the levels and gear progression all wrap back around to the stealth that we mentioned what feels like ages ago. Like I mentioned, your assassination damage is based on your level, and in almost every stealth section, there were a small to large number of enemies that I would not be able to take down quietly, as their health bars were far too large. This is a huge issue with fans, and it's a bit of an issue with me too, at first at least. At first it felt a little ridiculous that you couldn't insta-kill an enemy with stealth, but it wasn't until I received a few comments on my Syndicate video explaining how the difficulty in Syndicate could be essentially cheesed by just using stealth and taking out these guards that did massive amounts of damage to you. I never realized you could do this in Syndicate, but you could really just cruise through the entire game if you stuck with stealth, as the hidden blade just killed anyone no matter what level they were. So how could they fix this issue? Well, I think what they did made perfect sense. Assuming you're the proper level, that of which being within 2 levels of the fort you're trying to raid, you would always be left with 1, sometimes 3 beefy enemies that couldn't be taken down with a basic assassination. Now I know this might sound a little strange, but I really liked this system as it made stealth way more complicated. You now had to work around the fact that these bigger guys won't go down without a fight, so you're best to try and pick off as many grunts as you can so that when you do have to go take down the big guy, you can do it as quickly and painlessly as possible. And this is a viable strategy because trust me, if you get more than 2 or 3 enemies on you, you will be in huge danger. It's not like these bigger enemies are impossible to take down, because a critical assassination at most times takes their health down to at least a third, if not lower, meaning that you can use one of your overpower attacks or your hero strike ability to finish them off. I always found it fun to experiment with my skill tree and see what specs work best. I found the most efficient for stealth was to obviously put most of my skills into the stealth tree, but also speccing into the hunter tree a bit, making arrows do more damage and allowing me to snipe a cultist from a distance. Of course, I also put a few points into the warrior tree as well, so I wasn't totally useless in combat if I was spotted. My biggest issue with the stealth is again the inconsistency of it. The biggest example of this would be the critical assassinations. Sometimes when going to perform a critical assassination, I would hold triangle, but it didn't register. Still, while holding the triangle button, I would think, okay, I'll just take my finger off the button and then try it again. But when I did this, the game would count that as a normal triangle input, meaning I would do a normal assassination and not kill the enemy. And then the entire fort was alerted to my location and the whole operation was blown and So this didn't happen too often, but it did happen, I would say, once every 30 or so times. It wasn't enough for me to not use the ability, especially since the ability is so good, but it was enough that every time I went to perform the action, I had the thought in the back of my mind that kept telling me, what if it doesn't work? Another example of this is when you do get detected, I could sometimes very quickly kill them in combat and nobody would notice. But in other scenarios, once the guy spotted me, it felt like on the exact frame he saw me, everyone in the entire fort knew my location. When you do get into combat, you'll surely notice that there have been some changes to the formula. I would say the combat, much like climbing, reminded me of Breath of the Wild, as it's based around dodging and parrying. If you hold the shoulder buttons and time things right, you'll end up parrying an attack, leaving everyone in close proximity to you stunned. Not every attack can be parried, which is indicated through the red glow that they get just before executing a non-parryable attack, and if you jump out of the way of an attack with perfect timing, then time will slow down for a very brief period, allowing you to get a few hits in, similar to the combat system in Breath of the Wild. The combat at its core is pretty bare bones, but the way it truly shines is through the ability system. Moves like the Sparta kick allow you to stun an enemy, and the overpower attacks do insane damage while also looking as flashy as possible. The different weapons you use affects your combat too. A dagger will be faster than the hammer, but the hammer will edge out in overall damage. Spears work well for keeping a distance from a target, but I never found myself in too many situations where I preferred one weapon over the other. Also, when it comes to the overpower attacks I mentioned earlier, they vary based on your weapon. The swords and daggers focus on one enemy, drilling them with a fury of attacks, but the staff attacks have a wider radius, allowing for good crowd control. Spears generally have a mix of both, and hammers do massive damage to one target that can be chained together. The issue with these overpower attacks is that the staff and spear overpower attacks felt like they did way less damage than the sword or hammer ones. The hammer is easy crowd control, as you can chain the attacks together and do more damage with those attacks, making the spear and staff overpower attacks essentially useless in comparison. On the bright side, other abilities are great, with the bull rush ability being an awesome lunge at the enemy, and the burst of energy always looking awesome despite its unrealistic features, which, trust me, we'll talk about how unrealistic this game can be. When you first get the energy burst, it seems like you summon it with your chest, but after putting another 2 skill points into it, it does more damage, has a wider range, and on top of that, the animations change to Alexios and Cassandra reaching their hands into the sky before pounding it to the ground. God, I love it. A slight issue I ran into with the combat was that once I found a specific set of abilities, I had no reason to use any of the other ones. I could be wrong, and of course this is based on my personal experience, but I found myself only using the same few abilities in combat, no matter the situation, and it went like this. Run in, apply fire to my weapons, get a few hits in to build up burn damage and to get some adrenaline, use 1 bar to summon the energy in order to stun or even knock down my enemy, wail on him until I get my 3 bars of adrenaline, and use those to perform an overpower attack. And that's all I would do. Rinse and repeat. Because of this, I found the regular combat to get kind of stale by the end of my 70 hours with the game, but then again, I think anything after 70 hours would probably become stale. The parry timings also sometimes felt a little inconsistent. I did 2 playthroughs of Odyssey, with the first focusing on being a warrior and the second focusing more on stealth, while mixing in a bit of hunting on both playthroughs. I found that the stealth was a more enjoyable playstyle, but that was just for me. Experiences may vary. The gameplay in Odyssey can be overly simplified to just exploring and looting with a few enemies in the way. You very quickly get into the cycle of exploring, finding a new area, and killing some enemies and looting the place top to bottom for money, gear, or weapons. There are of course many ways in which the game spices up this gameplay loop, such as with the cultists I mentioned earlier. Finding these cultists require you to do some side quests and search for clues as to where to find them, and that's only if you want the game to tell you where they are. You could just find them on your own by attacking every person you meet. I had a really neat scenario where I was fighting a couple of guards and accidentally killed a civilian, and that civilian just so happened to be a cultist, and it's one of those memorable moments for me that makes me love this game. I should also clarify that the cult side mission is pretty surface level, as these characters don't have any stories tied to them. I mean, some do, but they were never really gripping or had me on the edge of my seat, and they're basically just a bunch of well-guarded high-level enemies. If you can't get enough of fighting, Odyssey does have a very basic arena where you can challenge someone and you'll be thrown into a pit where you have to defeat a few waves of enemies before you can face off against the top dog. But this area wasn't anything special by any means, but it did have a really cool side quest attached to it, and I could see some people losing a couple of hours into it. Of course, these activities take place across quite a handful of islands, and the only way to properly traverse them is through your ship. The naval exploration and combat functions very similarly to Black Flag, but I didn't enjoy it as much as I did in Black Flag. Of course, this is due to the naval system not being as fleshed out as Black Flag's, but I still found the naval battles to be pretty enjoyable, and boarding an enemy ship is still as fun as ever. The exploration of Odyssey is so good because there's always something interesting around the corner. I often found myself getting to a new island with the goal of doing the next story mission and telling myself, well, I should synchronize that viewpoint first, and then once I got up there, I would spot a side quest and end up checking it out, and then I'd end up raiding a bandit camp and so on, until eventually I found myself realizing that 2 hours just went by in what felt like 20 minutes. If you happen to get too wild, then you might begin to get a bounty on your head. The bounty will attract mercenaries, all of which are within your level range. They'll try to come and kill you to claim the reward. At first it was really cool to be walking around and suddenly hear that startling horn alerting me that the bounty hunter was nearby. But my issue is that when you kill a mercenary, another one can pop up within the minute, and the only way to get rid of this bounty is by killing a sponsor that is hopefully nearby. The bounty can also be paid off, however, but it doesn't shake the issue of trying to finish off a few soldiers in combat and having 5 mercenaries with mini boss size health bars overwhelming you. I eventually found myself immediately paying off any bounty as soon as a mercenary was nearby, and some have criticized the fact that you can pay off the bounty as a way of, again, pressuring you to use the microtransactions, but I, throughout almost the entire playthrough, had more money than I knew what to do with. People don't criticize the fact that you can pay off a wanted level in Grand Theft Auto when the system works the same way, so I'm not sure why some people think it's a big deal here. While we're on the topic of money, I want to know why they made everything so cheap. About halfway through my playthrough, I had so much money that I could buy anything without even thinking about it. Ship upgrades, no problem. Materials for the ship upgrades? Just buy them from the blacksmith. The only time I didn't have enough money for something was when I was on an island occupied by pirates. I was searching for information on a person and eventually found someone that had information, but she wouldn't tell me anything until I gave her 15,000 drachmae. I didn't have the money, but all I had to do was play 2 side missions to get enough money for her. Aside from that one time, money was pretty useless, and I wish they didn't give you so much of it, but it didn't affect my overall experience, and this very well could be a bit nitpicky. One issue that a lot of people have with the gameplay, world, and story is that it isn't very realistic. I understand that having Alexio shoot off a burst of energy or apply poison to his weapons whenever he'd like is not realistic, but I'm curious to see where the line of realism is drawn. Are you okay with Desmond touching an artifact which vaporizes him in order to save the world? Are you okay with the fact that throughout every Assassin's Creed game there have been world-changing artifacts that can grant the wearer immortality or allow the holder to take down an entire army? For me, personally, yeah, I'm okay with that. I can have a high suspension of disbelief, and I'm able to understand that things like regenerating health and unlimited stamina is something that, while not realistic, is done for the betterment of the game itself. I think when making a game, certain liberties have to be taken when it comes to realism, so as not to make the game boring. Things like the leap of faith in itself is completely unrealistic, as you would be decimated should you actually perform that in real life. The special gameplay abilities are never mentioned in the story either, so I think it's okay if Alexios can somehow light his sword on fire, as it's just a gameplay element. I mean, you can customize your horse to be a unicorn or a devilish horse of Hades, but it doesn't affect gameplay, so who cares, right? The point I'm trying to make here is that with literally any game you play, there's a certain point where you need to meet the game halfway, and there's a certain level that your suspension of disbelief needs to be at for you to fully enjoy it. Odyssey is one of those games with a lot of holy moments. The one with the Minotaur was just one of them, and others range from shock due to a twist in the story or giggles as I did something I wasn't meant to. For example, I had a cultist who was level 50, the highest level if you don't count the update that increased it to level 99. Regardless, I was pretty underleveled, so when I realized that this high-level cultist was on a boat, and also realizing that I hadn't upgraded my boat not once, I was pretty screwed. I tried to push through it, but I couldn't. I decided I would dedicate a few hours to upgrading my ship, and after a bunch of upgrades, I came back and still got annihilated. I had a ridiculous idea though. See, the game doesn't let you leave your ship when in combat, so I waited until I was about 300 meters away from the ship, got off, dove headfirst into the ocean, and after 20 minutes of swimming around trying to predict the ship's movements, I finally caught up with it through the violent waves and climbed aboard, where I proceeded to send the captain overboard while the entire crew was trying to kill me, leading to the cultist drowning. This was just so cool, and it was so fun telling my friends how I just completely cheesed this cultist. Of course, a lot of fun comes from the side quests, which are surprisingly good. Side quests in video games, and more specifically RPGs, can be a difficult thing to pull off, as it's easy to have side quests that just feel like busy work, and certain games like Gravity Rush 2 have side quests that pale in comparison to the main story. Odyssey's side quests have little contained stories in them that are just as good as the main storyline. That's not to say the main storyline is bad by any means, and we'll talk about that more later, but it's to say that the side quests are pretty well done. I also really like Gravity Rush 2, so don't get the impression that I don't like it. It's definitely a great game, and you should play it if you haven't already. One side quest saw me helping a woman who wanted the attention of a man, and when asking Alexios for help, a witch chimes in, explaining that she can make a love potion. We grab a few ingredients for her, and upon returning, she explains that the last ingredient is a lock of the woman's hair. The woman agrees to have a lock taken off, but the witch shaves her entire head and reveals that the love potion was a scam, and that she just shaved the woman's head so that the man she was after would be more attracted to the supposed witch rather than her. It's quests like these I found most interesting because it wasn't the basic, oh, now I have the love potion, thank you Missios, that I'd expected. Now, this doesn't mean that I didn't have a few basic side quests that just involved what was essentially go here, kill X, but there were a surprising amount of side quests I genuinely enjoyed, far more than just the excuse to run my spear through more chests. There were also no tail failing missions in this game to my knowledge, which is something people, including myself, have been complaining about since the first game. One of the bigger side missions or side activities you can do are the conquest battles. These conquest battles are an all-out balls-to-the-wall clash with easily over 100 soldiers on the battlefield. And all you have to do is take out the opposing team's forces, and these serve as a great way to earn experience, money, and loot. I do, however, wish they had more of a lasting impact. In order to initiate one of these battles, you have to do multiple things in order to weaken the nation's state, such as looting chests that contain the nation's funds, killing the current leader, killing as many of the nation's soldiers as you can. But after the conquest battle, as far as I know, nothing changes. These conquest battles are loads of fun though, and I hope to see this combat style with hundreds of enemies on screen return in future games. Now, there are a few more side quests and main quests that illustrate how awesome this game is, but in order to properly get into that, I should cover the story. The story has particularly been a point of contention as it supposedly breaks lore, and I will get to that, but first let's do a quick summary of the story for those who haven't played, and I hope you know by now that proceeding further in the video means you will be spoiled heavily. There have been a few points I've been avoiding making purely due to the fact that the game is still pretty recent, and I know a lot of people may not have played it. So this is your final warning, that after this point, I'll be talking about the story and referencing some really cool endgame side quests. The story begins with our main character doing some odd jobs in their home of Kefalonia. We find out through some flashbacks that their father threw both them and their sibling off a cliff as a child, and as such, he's been an orphan after washing up on the shore of Kefalonia. Eventually, we get a job to assassinate the Wolf of Sparta, who just so happens to be our father. We head over to where he's located, and upon doing some quests for his adopted son Stentor, we get to have a chit-chat which results in either his death by our hands or his resignation due to his guilt. He then tells us that we have to find our mother, and on our way, we run into the cult of Kosmos, and find out that its pseudo-leader Deimos is our sibling, and isn't much for talking either. We do, however, find our mother and make friends with a man named Brasidas along the way, until eventually we run into our father and Stentor again, where if our father is dead, we have to fight to the death with Stentor. We then have a showdown at the very mountain where both our characters and Deimos were thrown off, and depending on the decisions you make, Deimos dies, Deimos and your mother dies, or everyone lives. You then have a final ending that varies based on who lives or dies, but it doesn't really matter. If you were to follow a side quest, you would eventually be led to the gates of Atlantis, where you find your real father, Pythagoras. Triangle Man tells you that he needs 4 ancient Isu artifacts to seal the gates, and upon getting them, he reveals that he is hundreds of years old, and the thing that is keeping him alive is the Isu staff. Depending on our decisions, he either gives it up or we have to kill him for it. After doing this, we're transported to the modern day story with our modern day protagonist, Layla, where after getting to the gates of Atlantis herself, upon activating the Isu mechanism, she sees... she sees the main character who somehow got a suit, and they tell Layla that she's the key to saving the world or something. I don't know, man. The scene's ridiculous. Now, that was a brutal oversimplification of the story, but I just want to use it as a refresher for those who haven't played the game in a while. I enjoyed the story a lot, and for those who were wondering, the canon ending was with Cassandra as the main character, and with your mother, your father, and Stentor alive and Deimos dead. I have a few issues, however, with the story. The canon main protagonist is Cassandra, however, it seemed like Cassandra played a better villain than Alexios did. On my playthroughs, I tried to make Alexios as pig-headed and as much of a douche as possible while trying to make Cassandra a more kind-hearted character. It could be because Alexios was featured on the cover and I saw more of Alexios than I did Cassandra, but it felt like Cassandra made for a more intimidating villain. The dialogue between Alexios and Cassandra is identical, so it's not the lines, but it's just the way it was delivered.
The traitor is dead!
Cassandra's voice actor, in my opinion, was just far better than Alexios. I don't think the voice actor for Alexios did a bad job by no means, but I just personally preferred Cassandra. The dialogue in the side missions and main story missions were decently well written, but there was a strange amount of profanity. Don't get me wrong, if you've seen any of my Twitch streams, you would know that this is kind of the pot calling the kettle black here, but when it comes to a script, I think it's best to keep the profanity at a minimum. Of course, some emotional scenes had a few F-bombs, which is understandable given the context, but it felt like just enough for me to say, that seems a little excessive.
It confirmed what I always knew. You threw me off a fucking mountain!
Regardless, I found the story to be pretty good, though I felt my decisions didn't have a lot of weight to them. But at the same time, they sort of did. This is another aspect of the game that feels kind of inconsistent. At some points, the choices you make can have huge lasting impacts, such as the decision to spare or kill your father. On my first playthrough, I chose to kill him, and despite Stentor seeing me kill his father, nobody seemed to really care. It wasn't until hours later that I had a boss fight against Stentor, and a few more hours later, Brasidas said that he didn't trust me because I killed my father. I felt like these little impacts were cool, but there wasn't more of an impact on the overall playthrough. They explained later that the cult was responsible for making sure nobody found out that I killed him, but I felt like that didn't make a ton of sense because how could the cult possibly keep everyone, including Stentor, quiet? They could have done something really cool where Centaur becomes a permanent sponsor for the bounty on your head, leaving you with a constant bounty, which would totally change the way the game is played and make you feel like your choice had a more major impact. I also have a bit of a gripe with the alternative, which is just to confront your father and not kill him. If you choose not to kill him, he decides to resign from his role as the Wolf of Sparta and Stentor doesn't try to kill you. Otherwise, your father disappears as if he died, and so it makes the choice feel less impactful. It does, however, have some impact as he comes in at the nick of time to stop Stentor while he's challenging you to a battle, but other than that, the decision didn't mean much. Now, I don't expect them to have a wildly branching story with each choice, and expecting such would be a little ridiculous, but I think they could have given the story decisions more impact. I do like, however, that multiple decisions can affect your ending. On my first playthrough, I was set on killing Deimos from the get-go, and I tried to be as much of a bully as possible, and because of that, while on the mountain, I killed Deimos no problem. On my second playthrough though, I decided I really wanted to convert Deimos to our side and try to save everyone, which is a possible ending. However, I didn't make all the right decisions, so when I tried to convert Deimos, this happened.
You're home now.
I've done terrible things.
We all have, Alexios.
You can't protect anyone, can you?
Maybe we both should have died here that day.
But
No!
The gods are cruel.
Now, I don't do this often, but I genuinely gasped when this happened, as at least for me, I was totally caught off guard. I ended up with what I would consider to be one of the worst endings. I really appreciate that there are so many different endings, and I understand they aren't wildly different, but I still think it's better than nothing. I think the story missed a huge opportunity with its set piece. I'm not sure why they didn't dive deeper into the Peloponnesian War and have the conquest battles I mentioned earlier affect the story or at least the world in some way. It's not the first time that Ubisoft has had a really interesting backdrop for a game setting and done nothing with it, and while I still enjoyed the story, I can't help but feel like the story could have been much better had they incorporated the war between Athens and Sparta a little bit more. As far as the true ending, however, I think it's a little ridiculous. Like, I don't mind the whole Gates of Atlantis thing, and I certainly don't mind Layla as a new modern day protagonist, but the fact that Cassandra or Alexios shows up in a suit is so hilariously stupid that I can't say I didn't giggle at it. The true ending, however, does more to the lore than it does to the actual characters of Alexios and Cassandra. Speaking of which, I think we should address the way the game breaks lore. One of the arguments is that the Animus, the machine you use to relive your memories of your ancestors, should not allow you to make choices. Honestly, I don't think you're wrong if you think this. The Animus should, within lore, not be able to render multiple different endings, as those endings never truly happened. I think this is, however, alleviated by the fact that the book tied to this game has settled on an ending as canon. I also think that having only one ending can negatively affect the choice system, which is another way it breaks lore. The choices you make could not happen within the lore because it's someone's memories, which is also a valid point. Finally, the last point that I'll bring up is that performing a leap of faith is ridiculous because it was clearly established that the leap of faith is a huge part of being an assassin, and that was established in Origins, which takes place after Odyssey. So how is it that Alexios can perform one? These are all great points, but like I mentioned earlier, I think the people who criticize these aspects of the game are forgetting that Assassin's Creed has always been an unrealistic series. I mean, you use the Animus to relive memories of your ancestors where they jump off literal skyscrapers into about 2 feet of hay. The leap of faith, much like the decision during the story, are there to serve the overall enjoyability of the game. I can understand if you don't like the new mechanics, and that's perfectly fine, and I can agree that the story is ridiculous, but the way some people criticize this game seems like they're scrounging for things to dislike, so I can do nothing but disagree with the people who say this game spits in the face of Assassin's Creed lore. If you think that this game breaks the lore, I can totally agree with that, but what I can't agree with is the way people use this example to say that the game just isn't good overall. Like I said, if they need to add RPG decisions or elements or the leap of faith for a gameplay's sake, I think it's fine to excuse it. Odyssey has a lot of issues, but we can't sit here and act like the positives aren't there. Sure, the story isn't the strongest in the franchise, but that doesn't mean the story isn't at points awesome. It's clear so much research was done to make ancient Greece as believable as possible. They even have a special mode called Discovery Mode where there's no combat, no story, just exploration. You go on tours which shows you how daily life was like for a woman in Greece or politics in the city of Athens. To give an example of the amount of love and care put into the game, and this will be my final point to defend this game, let's talk about the endgame boss Medusa. When meeting your father Pythagoras, he tells you that you need to get 4 artifacts to close the gates to Atlantis. One of these is located on an island in the top right corner of the map. You'll notice that on the map, this place is fogged out. Going into this place, the fog becomes very heavy, and both your horse and eagle become unavailable because they're too scared of the area. As far as I know, this is the only area that they're too afraid to enter. Proceeding further in there are hundreds of petrified people, and there's a visible dust in the air. Their character even comments on how the air feels dead.
It's getting hard to breathe. Even the air is dead.
The trees here all feel unnatural too. A typical tree is quite straight and jagged, but these trees are very curved and resemble snakes, with a few resembling hands coming out to get you. The shadows on the ground make some trees look like heads with snakes coming out of the top too. After entering Medusa's domain, you find that the place looks torn apart and that there are snakes everywhere. The design of Medusa looks so cool too, that is when it shows up. But the point here is that the amount of love and care put into this place is incredible. I think I've given enough examples as to why I think Odyssey is a really good game, if an inconsistent one. While I think it stumbles, it can't be ignored that Ubisoft have once again created such an amazing world and have such a great game that while not a masterpiece, is easily worth the price of admission. I know that I'm pretty positive in these videos, and that's not because I'm sponsored by Ubisoft or anything, but hey, if any of you boys are listening, offers on the table. And it's not because I'm some games apologist, but it's because, and I don't know why, I'm so easily impressed by games. No matter how much I want to criticize the gameplay and the inconsistencies with the parry timings, I can't get past the fact that somebody put years of work into this. And while it might not be perfect, the fact that something that looks as good, plays as good, and feels as good as this is something that always blows me away. So something a lot of people have said about Odyssey is that it's a good game, but not a good Assassin's Creed game. In order to properly explain why I think Odyssey is in fact a good Assassin's Creed game, we should discuss what defines the Assassin's Creed franchise. I personally feel like the things that define an Assassin's Creed game are its stealth, combat, free running, and world. Having a world that is vast while also being historically accurate. Having stealth that makes you feel like a ghost slicing through a small army of Templars with dead silence, or being able to cut them down with swords if necessary. And being able to scale anything your eyes can see. I made a community post discussing what you guys think defines the Assassin's Creed franchise, and a few things you guys mentioned were the Hidden Blade, an Assassins versus Templar conflict, and a combat system that wasn't too RPG heavy. Firstly, let's talk about the Hidden Blade, or the lack of one. As you know, there isn't a Hidden Blade, but it makes sense lore-wise, so I don't really have an issue with it. The animations in which you assassinate targets with your spear still look awesome, and they look just as cool as the Hidden Blade animations, though I understand that this point is up to interpretation. The stealth in itself isn't changed much aside from the weapon you use. Of course, there are some assassination abilities, such as the spear throw, that are totally different, but they worked well and they don't serve as an overpowered attack. As far as combat goes, I can agree that the combat is different from previous Assassin's Creed games, however, its fundamentals are still very much the same. Assassin's Creed 2, 3, 4, and hell, any of them, have a foundation that consists of attacking and countering. Of course, the game's built upon that system by adding ranged weapons and certain enemies that need to have their defense broken, but at the end of the day, its foundation was attacking and countering. With Odyssey, it's still the same foundation, except they're doing different things with it. The combat is still a matter of attacking your enemy, but instead of countering, you're parrying, and performing a parry directly leads into a counterattack. Sure, the counter animations were much more flashy in older games, but the combat isn't so different with these newer games. There are abilities that add to the complexity of the combat, which in my opinion make it more enjoyable. The abilities could go either way, but to me, I feel like it adds a lot of complexity to the combat, which in my opinion makes it more enjoyable. As far as the Assassins versus Templar aspect goes, Alexios versus the Cult of Kosmos is basically the same thing. I mean, they share the same ideology, and the game draws a ton of parallels between the Cult and the Templars. As far as being an assassin goes, you can still be one, you can still wear the hood, you can do everything quietly, you can fight for the same ideals that the Assassins do. The Assassins versus Templars conflict is a conflict between order and freedom, a battle that is still present in this very game, even if it's under a different name. Even by the time you destroy the Cult, they make it very clear that an order similar to theirs will always rise up. Odyssey also follows its predecessors in the way it blurs the lines between the Assassins and Templars. When chasing down one of the cultists, you get the drop on her and she sets an altar on fire with a baby in the center of it. You can either save the baby or kill her, and if you do kill her, she remarks that she can't be that bad because we as the player just sacrificed a life for the chance to take another. One thing that has definitely changed is the free running. The system itself is more simplified, and they have, like I mentioned earlier, removed pretty much all depth that came with it, but I think that's okay because having a super complex parkour system would be a little pointless, due to the fact that you would rarely get the chance to use it. I wish they at least had a few more segments where you had to do some platforming. When on the way to the gates of Atlantis, you do need your parkour skills to cross a bed of lava, but I also found it much much faster to just tank the damage and run through it, as funny as it may seem. The world is just as good as any other Assassin's Creed, and I don't have much else to say on that because comparing the upsides and downsides of ancient Greece compared to ancient Italy would be ridiculous, as the entire point was accuracy and changes were only made if they benefited gameplay, and while I would have enjoyed more dense cities in Odyssey and higher buildings, that would completely compromise the world's accuracy. So while I do think the game made a lot of changes to the Assassin's Creed formula we've all gotten tired of, I don't think the game lost its identity by any means. Actually, I think Odyssey is one of the better Assassin's Creed games in the franchise. It still has nearly everything that has defined the series up to this point, and to answer the final question I had when playing this game, I can't definitively say that the game is better than or worse than the older Assassin's Creed games because they're so different. Yes, I just explained that they're similar, but what I mean is that the older games had a more complex traversal system and different worlds they take place in, and it makes them so hard to compare. I think that as far as a personal preference goes, I like them both for different reasons, which I know is a bit of an underwhelming answer to some of you. For some closing thoughts, I think Odyssey has definitely made some changes that work in the game's favor, and while the game can feel inconsistent at times, I think the game succeeds in being a great addition to the franchise and delivering great gameplay on top of a compelling story while changing things up enough for it to feel fresh and not enough for it to lose its identity. I really think you should give this game a chance if you haven't already, because for me at least, I had read a lot of comments from my other videos and I was prepared to play the worst game in the franchise, but I was more than pleasantly surprised, and I think you will be too. Hey guys, I'd just like to say thanks for making it to the end of this video, and big shout out to our patrons. A-Beat, Frank Riff, Ghostly Gaming, Pyrite, and Ashwin. You guys are awesome, and I really appreciate your guys' support. I'd also like to say thank you so much for 19,000 subscribers. That's crazy. Like, I don't even... I don't know what to say. That's really, like, surreal. Channel name change, that's happening. Basically, I'm just changing the name from Aqua to That Boy Aqua because Aqua is very hard to find when you search it up on YouTube. And since not a lot of people or anyone to my knowledge has the name That Boy Aqua on YouTube, I figure it would make it a lot easier. So thanks so much for sticking with me on this. The next video is going to be a bit of a smaller one. It's going to be on Infamous First Light. I've already kind of gotten started on that a little bit. And then after that one, I'm going to keep it a secret, actually. So yeah, check out my Twitch streams if you haven't. Those are always fun. And of course, check out Nam12399. He's working on a huge Final Fantasy VII video, and I think you guys are gonna like it. It'll be coming out pretty soon, so go subscribe and keep yourselves posted on that. Anyways, I love you guys so much. Thank you all for everything, and I'll see you guys next time.